The cold penetrated everything in Stalag Luft VII, seeping through the thin wooden walls of the barracks, through the threadbare blankets, through the layers of clothing the prisoners wore day and night, until it settled in their bones like a permanent resident. Captain Thomas Hartley sat on his bunk in the gathering darkness of a December afternoon in 1943, his fingers trembling not just from the cold, but from concentration, as he worked on what the other prisoners had come to call his obsession. Spread before him on a scrap of cloth were dozens of tiny pieces of dried bread, each no larger than a postage stamp, and on each piece, drawn with a sliver of charcoal salvaged from the stove, was a fragment of a map. Hartley was 32 years old, a navigator on a B-17 Flying Fortress that had been shot down over Bavaria 9 months earlier. Before the war, he had been a surveyor and cartographer in Colorado, spending his days measuring land and creating maps for mining companies and railroad surveys. He had a gift that his instructors in navigation school had called eidetic spatial memory, the ability to look at a map once and retain its details with almost photographic accuracy. In civilian life, it had been a useful skill. In a prisoner of war camp deep in eastern Germany, it might be the difference between life and death. The breadcrumbs were a necessity born of desperation. Paper was scarce in the camp, jealously guarded by the Germans, and too valuable for routine use. The prisoners received it only for letters home, and those were carefully monitored and censored. Anything that looked remotely like a map would be confiscated immediately, and the prisoner responsible would spend weeks in the cooler, a punishment cell where the cold could kill as surely as a bullet. But bread was everywhere, part of their meagre daily rations, and while the guards watched for tunnels and forged documents and hidden radios, they paid no attention to prisoners who carefully dried their bread rations until they became hard and flat, perfect miniature canvases. "Still at it, Tommy?" The voice belonged to Flight Lieutenant Peter Winters, a British pilot from Yorkshire who bunked 2 spaces down. Winters was 41, old for a pilot, with grey threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into bright skies. He had been shot down during a raid on Cologne and had spent the past year in various camps before being transferred to Stalag Luft VII 3 months ago. "Almost finished with the eastern sector," Hartley replied without looking up. His eyes were fixed on the tiny piece of bread before him, on the delicate lines he was drawing to represent roads and rail lines he had memorized from German maps he had glimpsed during interrogation after his capture. The Germans had been careless, leaving maps on tables during breaks in questioning, and Hartley's trained eye had absorbed every detail in those brief moments. Winters moved closer, keeping his body positioned to block the view from the door. Guards rarely entered the barracks in the late afternoon, but vigilance was second nature to men who had survived this long. "How accurate do you reckon those are?" "Accurate enough," Hartley said. He had been asked this question before, had explained that he could recall maps with perhaps 90% accuracy, that the details that mattered most, distances, directions, major landmarks, were solid in his memory. But Winters was new to the escape committee, hadn't yet learned to trust the American navigator's strange gift. The escape committee was a secret organization within the camp, comprised of a dozen prisoners who coordinated all escape attempts and managed the various support activities required, forging documents, creating civilian clothing from uniform pieces, hoarding food and supplies, and gathering intelligence about the surrounding territory. Hartley had been recruited 2 months after his arrival, when word of his mapping skills had reached the committee's leader, a Canadian squadron leader named James MacKenzie, who had already made 3 unsuccessful escape attempts from other camps. MacKenzie entered the barracks now, his tall frame stooping slightly to clear the low doorway. At 6'3", he towered over most of the other prisoners, and his presence commanded immediate attention even in the crowded, noisy barracks. He was 35, from Alberta, with the weathered face of someone who had grown up outdoors and the calculating eyes of a man who never stopped planning his next move. "Hartley, we need to talk," MacKenzie said quietly. "In the usual place. 5 minutes." The usual place was a corner of the latrine building, where a loose board in the wall created a small gap that defeated the acoustic surveillance the prisoners suspected the Germans had installed. It was one of the few places in camp where private conversations could be held with reasonable confidence. Hartley carefully gathered his breadcrumb maps, wrapped them in the cloth, and tucked them into a hiding place he had created by loosening a board in his bunk frame. Then he pulled on his coat, a tattered RAF greatcoat traded from a British prisoner for 2 cigarettes, and followed MacKenzie out into the bitter cold. The camp was arranged in a typical pattern, rows of long wooden barracks surrounded by double fences of barbed wire, with watchtowers at each corner manned by guards with machine guns. Beyond the fences lay a cleared killing zone, then forest stretching in all directions. They were somewhere in eastern Germany, perhaps 50 miles from the Polish border, in territory that even the guards admitted was increasingly threatened by the advancing Soviet armies. The prisoners could hear artillery fire sometimes at night, distant thunder that spoke of battles being fought over ground they might have to cross if they escaped. In the latrine building, MacKenzie waited until they were alone before speaking. "We've got a problem. The tunnel under Barracks C has been discovered. The Germans found it this morning during a spot inspection. They've arrested 8 men and sealed the entrance. That was our best chance for a mass breakout before spring." Hartley absorbed this news with the fatalistic calm that prisoners developed. Tunnels were discovered all the time. It was the nature of the game. The prisoners dug, the Germans found them, everyone started over. "What about the other tunnels?" "Still safe as far as we know, but this changes things. The commandant is threatening to move us to a camp farther east, closer to Poland. If that happens, we'll be in range of Soviet advances. Being liberated by the Russians might be better than staying in German hands, but it's also more likely we'll get caught in the fighting. We need to accelerate the escape timeline." "How many men?" 3, initially. A small group has better chances of moving undetected. You, me, and Winters. You, because we need your maps. Me, because I speak German well enough to pass, at least briefly. Winters, because he's the best scrounger in camp, and he's already got civilian clothes prepared. We go over the wire next week during the Christmas concert. Everyone will be distracted, including the guards. Hartley felt his pulse quicken. After 9 months of planning and preparation, the moment was finally coming. Over the wire meant cutting through the fence rather than tunnelling under it, a desperate and dangerous method that usually failed but occasionally succeeded through sheer audacity. During the annual Christmas concert, when the entire camp gathered in the mess hall, for an evening of amateur performances, the guard force was reduced to a skeleton crew. It was the best chance they would get. What about papers? Being prepared, Winters has contacts among the guards, gets materials in exchange for cigarettes and chocolate from Red Cross packages. We'll have travel permits, work documents, everything we need to pose as foreign labourers heading west away from the Russian advance. That story will hold up as long as we don't encounter anyone too official. And the route? That's where your maps come in. We need to know every road, every rail line, every village between here and the Swiss border. 500 kilometres, give or take. On foot, hiding during the day, moving at night, it'll take us at least 3 weeks, probably longer. We can't afford to get lost or walk into a Wehrmacht barracks by accident. Hartley thought about the breadcrumb maps hidden in his bunk, about the hundreds of hours he had spent reconstructing the geography of Eastern Germany from memory. "I can do it. I can give you a route that avoids major towns and military installations. But you have to understand, my information is months old. Troop positions change, roads get destroyed, rail lines get bombed. We'll need to adapt as we go. That's why we need you with us instead of just taking the maps. Your head contains more useful intelligence than any piece of paper. You can update the route based on what we see and hear. They spent the next hour discussing details. MacKenzie had been planning this escape for months and had contingencies for every stage. If they made it past the wire, they would head southwest toward Bavaria, staying in forested areas and avoiding roads during daylight. They would pose as Estonian workers if challenged. Estonia was occupied by Germany, and Estonian labourers were common throughout the Reich. Winters spoke enough Russian to fake Estonian if needed, and Mackenzie's German would do the talking if they encountered officials. Hartley would pretend to be mute, a cover story that explained why he couldn't speak. The week before Christmas passed in a blur of final preparations. Hartley spent every spare moment refining his breadcrumb maps, adding details he remembered from conversations with newly arrived prisoners who had been shot down over different parts of Germany. Each piece of information was valuable. A bridge that had been destroyed by bombing, a town that now housed a Wehrmacht garrison, a forest where partisans were rumoured to operate. He incorporated everything into his maps, creating a living document that represented the most current intelligence available. Winters, true to his reputation, had assembled an impressive collection of materials. He had traded cigarettes and chocolate for civilian clothing, threadbare jackets and trousers that could pass for what foreign labourers wore. He had obtained a small compass, hidden inside a button that unscrewed. He had even managed to get his hands on a pair of wire cutters, smuggled into camp by a guard who didn't ask questions as long as the cigarettes kept coming. The guard in question was a 40-year-old Bavarian named Muller, who had lost 2 sons on the Eastern Front and saw no reason to care whether a few Allied prisoners escaped or not. MacKenzie spent his time perfecting their cover story and forging the necessary documents. He had help from a former art student named Davies, who had become the camp's master forger, capable of reproducing German stamps and signatures with uncanny accuracy. The travel permits they created identified them as Estonian labourers, being transferred from a factory in Saxony to another in Bavaria. It was plausible enough to survive casual inspection, though it would never hold up if they encountered the Gestapo or military intelligence. On December 23rd, the camp was transformed for the Christmas concert. The Germans, perhaps feeling generous in the holiday season, or simply wanting to maintain the fiction that they were following the Geneva Conventions, had allowed the prisoners to decorate the mess hall with whatever materials they could scavenge. Paper chains made from old letters, stars cut from tin cans, even a makeshift Christmas tree fashioned from pine branches smuggled in from the forest. The orchestra, comprised of prisoners who had instruments sent from home or who had built crude versions from scraps, practiced carols and popular songs. Hartley sat through the afternoon rehearsal with his stomach in knots. Tonight. It would happen. Tonight. Everything depended on timing, on luck, on a dozen variables they couldn't control. If the guards were more alert than usual, if the weather changed and made visibility too good, if someone in the camp betrayed them, any of these things could end with bullets and barbed wire, and 3 more bodies added to the cemetery beyond the east fence. At 1800 hours, the entire camp assembled in the mess hall, nearly 400 prisoners crowded onto benches, filling every available space. The guards were present too, perhaps 50 of them, stationed around the perimeter and at the exits. But Mackenzie had been right. The guard force was thinner than usual, with many soldiers given leave for the holiday. The towers were still manned, their searchlights sweeping across the compound at regular intervals. But there were gaps in the coverage. blind spots that could be exploited by men who knew where to look. The concert began with carols. Silent Night, sung in English, French and Polish, the voices of men from a dozen nations blending together in fragile harmony. Hartley found himself deeply moved despite his nervousness. These men, prisoners and guards alike, were all somebody's sons, somebody's brothers. Most of them wanted nothing more than to go home, to survive this war and return to the lives they had left behind. The fact that they were enemies seemed, in that moment, like a cruel, cosmic joke. At 1845, during a rousing performance of Jingle Bells that had the whole room singing along, Hartley, MacKenzie and Winters quietly slipped toward the latrines. Nobody paid them any attention. Men were constantly coming and going, and the guards were focused on the performance. They moved through the latrine building to the back wall, where Winters had loosened several boards earlier in the day. They squeezed through the gap into the space between the latrine and the perimeter fence. The night was bitterly cold, the stars brilliant overhead. Hartley's breath came in white plumes as he crouched in the shadow of the latrine, watching the searchlight from the nearest tower sweep past. MacKenzie counted under his breath, timing the intervals. 30 seconds of light, 45 seconds of darkness, 30 seconds, 45 seconds. The pattern was consistent. When the light moved away, they ran. 3 men in dark clothing sprinting across 20 meters of open ground to reach the fence. Hartley felt exposed, vulnerable, certain that at any moment he would hear the distinctive chatter of a machine gun and feel bullets tearing through his body. But the only sound was their boots crunching on frozen earth and the distant singing from the mess hall. They reached the fence, and Winters immediately went to work with the wire cutters. The tool bit through the first strand with a quiet snick that seemed impossibly loud. Then another strand, and another. Winters worked with practiced efficiency, creating a gap large enough for a man to crawl through. The searchlight was coming back around. They had maybe 20 seconds. Hartley went first, dropping to his belly and wriggling through the gap. The wire caught on his coat, held him for a terrifying moment, then released. He rolled clear and into the ditch beyond the fence. MacKenzie came next, his larger frame barely fitting through the opening. Then Winters, pulling the wire cutters through after him. They lay in the ditch for a full minute, waiting to see if the alarm would sound. Silence, except for the carol singing and the wind in the trees. Then MacKenzie was moving, crawling away from the fence toward the forest, and Hartley and Winters followed. They reached the tree line without incident and allowed themselves a moment of stunned relief. They had done it. They were outside the wire, free for the first time in months. But they were also in the middle of enemy territory, with 500 kilometers to cover before they reached safety. The escape was just beginning. They moved through the forest using Hartley's mental map to navigate. He had memorized the terrain around the camp from glimpses through the fence and conversations with guards. There was a logging road 2 kilometers to the southwest that they needed to avoid, a creek 3 kilometers south that they could follow to stay oriented, a small village 5 kilometers west that housed a military training facility. All of this information was in Hartley's head, and he guided them through the darkness with quiet confidence. They walked all night, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. By dawn, they had covered perhaps 15 kilometers and found shelter in an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the forest. They ate cold rations, bread and ersatz sausage they had saved from their prison meals, and took turns keeping watch while the others slept fitfully. The days that followed fell into a brutal routine. Hide during daylight hours, sleeping in barns or abandoned buildings, or simply in the forest under piles of pine needles. Move at night, always southwest, avoiding roads and towns, living off their meagre supplies and whatever they could steal from gardens or storage sheds. Hartley's maps proved invaluable. He would spread the breadcrumbs on the ground during their rest stops, piecing together the route ahead, updating based on what they observed. A bridge marked on his mental map, but now destroyed, requiring a detour. A town that should have been small, but was now full of troops retreating from the Eastern Front, forcing them to circle wide. On the fourth night, they had their first close call. They were crossing a road when a military convoy appeared suddenly around a bend, trucks full of soldiers heading east. There was no time to hide. MacKenzie immediately stepped into the road and waved his arms, the picture of a confused foreign labourer. The lead truck stopped and a sergeant leaned out, shouting in German. MacKenzie responded in rapid German, explaining that they were Estonian workers whose truck had broken down, that they were trying to reach the next town. He showed the forged papers. The sergeant barely glanced at them, more concerned with keeping the convoy moving. He gestured impatiently toward the east, telling them the town was that direction, then ordered his driver forward. The trucks rumbled past, and the three escapees stood at the roadside, watching them disappear into the darkness. "That was too close," Winters muttered when they were alone again. "It'll get closer," MacKenzie replied grimly. "The farther west we go, the more troops we'll encounter. Everyone's retreating or regrouping. We're walking through a battlefield." They pressed on, and MacKenzie was proven right. The countryside was increasingly militarized. They saw bombed-out villages, columns of refugees fleeing the advancing Soviets, military checkpoints on every major road. Twice they had to hide while search parties passed nearby. Whether searching for them specifically or for deserters, they couldn't tell. On the 8th day, disaster struck. They had taken shelter in a barn outside a small Bavarian town, planning to rest through the day and move again at nightfall. But a local farmer discovered them in the afternoon, and before they could stop him, he had run off to report them to the authorities. They had perhaps 10 minutes before soldiers arrived. "We run," MacKenzie said, already moving toward the door. "Split up if we have to. Rendezvous at the church in the town 2 maps south. Hartley, you remember it?" Hartley nodded, his mind already pulling up the image of his breadcrumb maps. There was a church in a village about 20 kilometers southwest, distinctive because it had been marked in his original German map with a notation about medieval architecture. They ran from the barn as a truck full of soldiers appeared on the road. Shots rang out, bullets kicking up dirt. Hartley felt one pass close enough to hear it buzz by his ear. They reached the forest and scattered, each man taking a different direction. Hartley ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like rubber. He had no idea if the others had escaped, no idea if he was being pursued. He simply ran, driven by animal panic and the desperate desire to stay free. When he finally collapsed behind a fallen log, gasping for air, he was alone in an unfamiliar part of the forest with no supplies and no companions. The next 3 days were the hardest of his life. He moved only at night, drinking from streams and eating nothing except some raw turnips he dug from a frozen garden. He used the stars to navigate, keeping southwest, trusting his memory of the maps to guide him toward the rendezvous point. He avoided all human contact, hiding whenever he heard voices or saw lights. On the 11th night of their escape, he reached the village with the medieval church. He hid in the cemetery and waited, watching for any sign of MacKenzie or Winters. Hours passed. Dawn approached, and he was beginning to fear the worst when he saw a figure moving among the gravestones. MacKenzie, looking gaunt and exhausted, but alive. "Winters," Hartley whispered when they met. MacKenzie shook his head. "Haven't seen him since we split. We wait here 1 more day. If he doesn't show, we assume he's been captured and move on." They waited, hiding in a mausoleum, taking turns watching the church. Winters never came. On the 12th night, they resumed their journey as a pair, carrying the weight of their missing companion like a stone. The loss of Winters was a blow to morale and practicality. He had been carrying most of their remaining food and all of their German currency. Without him, they were forced to steal more frequently, take greater risks. MacKenzie began to show signs of illness, a deep cough that got worse each night. Hartley's own body was failing, his feet blistered and bleeding, his stomach a constant knot of hunger. But they kept moving. Hartley's maps remained their greatest asset. He navigated them around Wehrmacht positions, found unguarded crossing points on rivers, identified villages where they might find sympathizers. His photographic memory became the difference between capture and freedom, again and again. On the 16th night, they encountered someone unexpected. They were sheltering in a barn when the door opened and an elderly man entered carrying a lantern. He saw them immediately and froze. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the man spoke in thickly accented English. "You are prisoners. Escaped." It wasn't a question. MacKenzie tensed, ready to fight or run. But Hartley noticed something. The man's expression wasn't hostile or frightened. It was calculating. "We mean no harm," Hartley said quietly. "We're just trying to reach Allied lines." "You are far from Allied lines. Switzerland is closer." The man set down his lantern and studied them. "I am Hans. This is my barn. I fought in the First War. I know what it is to be far from home, to want only to survive. I can help you, but it is dangerous for me." "Why would you help us?" MacKenzie asked suspiciously. "Because this war has already taken 2 of my grandsons, and I do not wish to see it take more young men, whatever uniform they wear. And because I remember American soldiers sharing their food with me in 1918, when I was prisoner. Perhaps this is how I repay that debt." Hans provided them with food, real food, bread and cheese and sausage that tasted like heaven after weeks of near starvation. He gave them better directions to the Swiss border, warned them about a new checkpoint that had been established on the road they planned to take. Most importantly, he gave them hope. "You are brave men," Hans said before they left. "May God protect you." They left the barn with renewed determination. The Swiss border was perhaps 80 kilometers away, maybe 4 or 5 nights of travel if they could maintain their pace. So close, yet still so far. Mackenzie's condition worsened. His cough turned into full-blown pneumonia, his fever spiking so high that he became delirious. On the 19th night, he could barely walk. Hartley half-carried him for hours, but it was becoming clear that MacKenzie wouldn't make it much further without medical care. "Leave me," MacKenzie whispered during a rest stop. "You can move faster alone. Get to Switzerland. Tell them what happened." "We're not leaving anyone else behind," Hartley said firmly. "Winters is already gone. I'm not losing you too." "You don't have a choice. I'm slowing you down. Every hour we delay increases the chance you'll be captured. And you're the one who matters, Hartley. Those maps in your head. That intelligence could save lives when the Allies invade. You need to survive." Hartley wanted to argue, wanted to insist they would make it together. But he knew MacKenzie was right. The Canadian was dying, whether from pneumonia or exposure or simply exhaustion. Carrying him further would only result in both of them being captured. "I'll come back for you," Hartley promised. "Once I reach Switzerland, I'll tell them where you are. They'll send help." "Just go," MacKenzie said. "And Hartley, make it mean something. Make sure this wasn't for nothing." Hartley left MacKenzie hidden in a hayloft, with what remained of their food and water. He marked the location carefully in his memory, another map that would never be forgotten. Then he turned southwest and walked alone into the darkness. The final leg of the journey was a blur of exhaustion and determination. Hartley moved mechanically, one foot in front of the other, driven by the need to honour the sacrifices of his companions. Winters, captured or dead. MacKenzie, dying in a barn. All of them had risked everything for this escape, and Hartley was the only one left to make it count. On the 21st night, he saw lights in the distance that didn't look like a German town. They were arranged differently, the glow softer somehow. He consulted his mental map and felt his heart leap. Swiss border. He was looking at Switzerland. The actual crossing was almost anticlimactic. He simply walked across a frozen stream that marked the boundary, climbed a low hill, and found himself staring at a Swiss border post. The guards there saw a skeletal figure in ragged clothes stumbling toward them, and immediately raised their rifles. "American," Hartley croaked in English, raising his hands. "Escaped prisoner of war. American." They took him into custody, which really meant taking him to a warm room with a fire and real food and a doctor who examined his frost-bitten feet and various other injuries. They questioned him extensively, and Hartley told them everything, about the camp, about the escape, about Winters and MacKenzie. "We'll contact the Red Cross about your friend," a Swiss officer promised. "But I must be honest, the chances he survived are not good. We will try." From Switzerland, Hartley was eventually repatriated to Allied control. He arrived in England in January 1944, nearly 2 months after his escape began. He was immediately debriefed by military intelligence, and when he described his breadcrumb maps, they were sceptical until he began drawing. He reconstructed from memory dozens of detailed maps showing German positions, fortifications, transportation networks, and troop concentrations across eastern Germany. The intelligence was so valuable that he spent 3 weeks in London doing nothing but draw maps and answer questions from analysts who couldn't believe the level of detail one man could retain. The information he provided was incorporated into planning for the Allied advance into Germany. Roads he had marked as destroyed were avoided. Bridges he had noted as intact became strategic objectives. Towns he had identified as lightly defended were prioritized for rapid capture. His maps, drawn on breadcrumbs in a freezing prisoner-of-war camp, helped save countless Allied lives in the final year of the war. Winters eventually returned after the war ended. He had been recaptured within hours of their separation and sent to a punishment camp, where he survived until liberation by advancing Soviet forces. He was 40 pounds lighter and missing several teeth from beatings, but alive. MacKenzie never made it. The Red Cross investigated after receiving Swiss information about his location, but when they reached the farm, they found that he had died of pneumonia 2 days after Hartley left him. The farmer had buried him in a small cemetery behind his barn. After the war, Mackenzie's body was exhumed and returned to Canada, where he was buried with full military honours. Hartley returned to the United States in 1945 and struggled to readjust to civilian life. He had nightmares about the camp, about the escape, about leaving MacKenzie behind. He eventually resumed his work as a surveyor, but the mountains of Colorado never felt as dangerous as the forests of Germany had. He married late in life, had 2 children, and rarely spoke about the war except to say he had been a prisoner. In 1963, he received a letter from an unexpected source. Hans, the German farmer who had helped them, had somehow tracked him down through veteran organizations. The letter was brief and written in careful English. "I wish to tell you that your friend, the tall Canadian, did not die alone. I was with him in his final hours. He spoke of you, of the maps you drew on bread. He said to tell you, if I ever found you, that the escape was not for nothing, that you made it mean something. I hope this brings you peace. The war took much from all of us. I am glad it did not take you." Hartley kept that letter until his death in 1989. It was found among his possessions along with something else, a small cloth bag containing dozens of tiny pieces of bread, hardened to the consistency of wood, each one marked with faint charcoal lines depicting roads and rivers and forests. The breadcrumb maps that had guided 3 desperate men across 500 kilometers of enemy territory, that had helped plan the liberation of Europe, that represented the unbreakable determination of prisoners who refused to give up hope. The maps were donated to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, where they remain on display today. The accompanying placard reads, "These maps, drawn from memory on bread rations by Captain Thomas Hartley while imprisoned at Stalag Luft VII, demonstrate the extraordinary ingenuity and courage of Allied prisoners of war." Captain Hartley's cartographic memory and navigational skills enabled him to create detailed maps that aided both his escape and subsequent Allied military operations. His story reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human mind remains the most powerful tool for survival and resistance. But Hartley himself, in one of the rare interviews he gave late in life, put it more simply. "People ask me how I did it, how I remembered all those details. The truth is, I was terrified every moment of every day. Fear sharpens the mind wonderfully. But more than that, I knew that if I gave up, if I let the memory fade, then Winters and MacKenzie and all the others who didn't make it home, their sacrifices would be meaningless. So I remembered. I drew my maps on breadcrumbs because bread was all I had, but I would have drawn them in the dirt, on tree bark, on the walls of my cell, whatever it took. Because remembering, and resisting, and refusing to surrender, that's what keeps you human when everything else is trying to break you." He paused, his eyes distant, seeing something the interviewer couldn't. The maps weren't just about geography. They were about refusing to forget who we were, what we were fighting for. Every line I drew was an act of defiance. Every kilometer we walked toward freedom was a victory against despair. That's what I want people to understand. It's not about the breadcrumbs or the escape, or even the intelligence we provided. It's about the fact that even when they lock you up, even when they take away everything else, they can't take away your mind and your will to be free. That's the real story. That's what matters.